Hi everybody, welcome back. So we've had some really great sessions so far. It's been really interesting to hear from Steve about PPI and bowel cancer and Alicia and Nigel about IBD. And we're continuing the theme of IBD into this next session. And this session is going to be chaired by our CEO, Lynn Dunn. So I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you, Sam. It's really lovely to be here. I don't think I can say any more than it's a great privilege to be the Chief Exec of Bowel Research UK and to get to hear about all this wonderful research that we fund. This session this afternoon is called The Latest in Bowel Disease Research, and it's specifically focused on inflammatory bowel disease. And we have three great speakers with us. We have Dr. Horace Williams, Jacqueline Black, and Sue Blackwell, who've joined us for this session this afternoon. Once again, just a quick explanation of how the Q&A will work. If you type in any questions that you have for any of our speakers into the chat, and then they'll be asked during the Q&A session at the end of each session, or at the end of the whole session. There'll be one Q&A for all three speakers, so please indicate who your question is for. So without further ado, I think I would love, and it is my privilege, to introduce Dr. Horace Williams to you. He is a consultant gastroenterologist at Imperial College London with a particular interest in inflammatory bowel disease. And he's going to talk about his BI UK funded project, which he's running in collaboration with Dr. Sharmili Balaraja, looking into the impact of ethnicity on IBD. So Horace, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share the screen. I hope you can see the screen now.
See and hear everything perfectly. Thank you.
Great. So thank you very much for that introduction. I'm Horace Williams, a gastroenterologist at Imperial, and I'm here to talk about our Bowel Research UK co-funded research on the topic of ethnicity and inflammatory bowel disease. The inflammatory bowel diseases are characterized by chronic inflammation of the intestines, and they comprise Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and a small subset of patients in whom this distinction can't be made, and they're called inflammatory bowel disease type unclassified. There are rising numbers of patients affected by IBD in the UK and worldwide. It's predicted that more than 1 in 100 people in the UK will be affected by these conditions by 2025. And I'm sure the majority of you know the variety of symptoms that can be associated with IBD, predominantly diarrhea and blood and mucus in the stool, but also bloating, abdominal pain, urgency, and weight loss. Causes of IBD have not yet been fully elucidated, but there are many factors which have been shown to contribute to IBD, and these include genetic susceptibility, the gut microbiome, and environmental factors, as well as things like diet, smoking, hygiene, a previous appendectomy, sleep, stress, and physical activity, and perhaps other things that we don't yet know about. The management of IBD is becoming increasingly complex and effective, as pharmaceutical research and development sees the number of treatments for both UC and Crohn's increasing year on year. You start off with certain treatments for milder disease, different ones for more moderate disease, and then different things again for severe disease, including the possibility of surgery. But how do we pick the most appropriate treatment for individual patients? Well, that's a question that is still being answered, and it's proving difficult to develop specific treatment algorithms. The ethnic makeup of the UK is changing, and here are the data from the 2021 census showing the different ethnic groups and their numbers, and how these compare to the 2011, 2001, and 1991 censuses. There are rising numbers of people in these groups who are being affected by inflammatory bowel disease. And there is some evidence to show that the disease behaves differently in these patients. However, IBD research in these groups has been limited to date. The first part of our BRUK sponsored research is the analysis of the NIHR IBD bioresource database. And we are using this resource to develop a better understanding of the impact of ethnicity on IBD. We're specifically looking at the areas of the gastrointestinal tract that are affected by the diseases, by the disease severity, and by response to treatment. This nationwide database has the clinical details of more than 35,000 patients. As I say, detailed information is recorded about each, and we are currently comparing the data from different ethnic groups to look for significant differences between them. The second part of our research is looking at whether the microbiome and the metabolome can act as predictors of response to treatment. Now, we know that your dietary diversity can affect your gut microbiota or microbiome. This describes the community of microorganisms which is present in a particular environment, such as bacteria, fungi, and viruses. And your gut microbiome is affected by numerous factors, including diet and medication use. Your metabolome is the complete set of small molecule chemicals which are found within a specific biological sample. And these metabolites may be produced by the host mammal itself, i.e. us, or by the gut microbes which are living in your bowel, or indeed some of the metabolites are what are called mammalian microbial co-metabolites produced by joint actions of the host and the gut microbes. And these affect your health status, and they are affected by numerous factors, as we've said, including diet and medication use. It's known that the gut microbiome differs between patients with IBD and control groups of individuals. Molecular microbial studies have shown certain variations in findings, depending on whether you look at ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, active or inactive disease, and other combinations. But the most consistent changes which have been found are a decrease in the microbial diversity in IBD, notably a reduction in the Firmicutes phylum, one of the types of bacteria which live in the gut, and increase in the Enterobacteriaceae, which include E. coli, which most people have heard of. But what are the metabolic effects of these gut microbiome changes, which we see in IBD patients? Well, we recently undertook a systematic review of all of the published papers about metabolomics and IBD, and this allowed us to document the consistent changes which we see through all these studies of the metabolic changes associated with IBD. And as you can see, different biosamples, urine, stool, blood, tissue, and breath have all been analysed and have a characteristic signature in IBD patients. And these tend to reflect inflammation, increased energy metabolism, and the gut microbial dysregulation that we've spoken about. So for our study, we are recruiting patients of different ethnicities who are commencing different drug treatments. We're taking blood, urine, and stool samples at specific intervals, and these samples are being analysed using metabolomic and microbiome analyses to see if differences in the gut microbiome or the metabolome can predict response to treatment, in which case we'll be able to tailor our therapies more effectively. So this research should provide insights into IBD in an under-researched cohort. We're going to be using this large national database for this purpose for the first time, and also using omic technologies to see if we're able to predict treatment response to allow better tailoring of IBD medications and potentially avoid side effects and medications which aren't going to work. So I'd like to thank my co-applicants in this grant, Sharmili Balaraja, who is undertaking this work as her PhD, Julia Marchesi, Gia Lee, Ben Mullish, Lucy Hicks, and Laura Martinez-Gilly. I thought I'd just leave you with some of the highlights of Imperial. There we have the Queen's Tower of the Imperial main campus in South Kensington. We have the Hammersmith Hospital. We have Charing Cross Hospital, and we have the Clarence Memorial Wing of St Mary's Hospital, on which we have the plaque commemorating the room in which Sir Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. Thank you very much.
Horace, thank you so much for a really interesting session, and I can see lots of great questions in the chat already. But we will move on, and we will do our best to keep to time. And so it's my great pleasure now to introduce to you Jacqueline. Now, I had the pleasure of meeting Jacqueline Jacqueline Black last year here at Royal College when we were filming some of our PhD students. And Jacqueline is a doctoral researcher at King's College London with a background in health psychology, and is looking a lot into the roles of stress and resilience in the early stages of ulcerative colitis. So it's an absolute joy to see you, Jacqueline, and say hello. And I know that you are going to do as a great session. You've called it "Let's Talk About Stress," an overview of research linking stress and inflammatory bowel disease. So again, without further ado, Jacqueline, over to you, and thank you so much for being part of this today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me over. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear and see you.
Yes. And let me just make sure to see if the technology works as well. So Hopefully you can all see that. I've got the taskbar in front of, there we go. There we go. So today I'll be talking about stress and giving you an overview of research linking stress and inflammatory bowel disease. So I'm going to look at what research has found out about stress and inflammatory bowel disease, what I found in my research so far, and to ask you to think about your own experiences of stress and health. And so to that end, I wanted to pose a question to the audience members, and feel free to comment in the chat as I talk on whether stress affects your IBD or other chronic health condition you might have, and if so, in what way it affects it. I'm hoping we'll have a little time at the end to discuss these comments and compare them to the research. Of course, if you have any questions, please add those too. So, this presentation will cover why we should care about stress in IBD, what the research generally has found out about it, and what my research is looking at specifically. So I feel a bit awkward trying to define inflammatory bowel disease directly after a gastroenterologist has just done it, but very quickly, as a reminder, it's a chronic autoimmune condition which affects over 600,000 people at last estimates in the United Kingdom. IBD is a chronic inflammation of the digestive system and typically is characterized by symptoms such as bloody diarrhea, stomach pain, urgency to go to the toilet, and fatigue. It's a fluctuating condition, which means that people go through periods of relapse and remission where they do not experience their usual symptoms for a time before the disease becomes active again. There are different types of IBD, as we've heard, but the two have the most people affected by them are Crohn's disease, which affect any part of the digestive tract, and ulcerative colitis, which is confined to the bowel. So why do we care about stress and IBD? Well, research has shown that people with IBD have higher rates of psychological distress than the general population, as well as higher rates of anxiety and depression. People continue to report worry, anxiety, and depression even when the symptoms of IBD are in remission. So stress has been suspected as a trigger for the onset of IBD since at least the 1930s, and as a trigger for disease flares. However, the exact nature of stress's role within IBD has remained elusive. It doesn't take much to appreciate why IBD may be stressful to live with. Being diagnosed with any incurable chronic condition can be a stressful life event. IBD symptoms typically appear in younger adults between 15 and 35, requiring them to deal with unmanaged symptoms while going through an often unpleasant and lengthy diagnosis process. An IBD diagnosis can trigger profound changes for people as well, as it impacts their work, education, leisure time, family, relationships, and even their financial situation. How people perceive themselves and how they are perceived by others can change. Medical appointments, medication, and self-management can provide additional burdens at a time where people's resources are frequently depleted from fatigue, sleep deprivation, and pain. Inflammatory bowel disease is inherently unpredictable as a fluctuating condition. The symptoms can start and restart without warning. People can feel a loss of control over their bodies, and it can feel with the symptoms of incontinence and urgency to go to the toilet, an unpredictable condition. It is a condition that increases perceived threat to a person, with the risk of life-threatening conditions such as bowel cancer increasing, as well as the need to undergo unpleasant procedures like colonoscopies. There is fear of the unknown, as people do not generally know much about IBD before they are diagnosed. And finally, the embarrassment caused by symptoms and having to routinely discuss bowel movements and other things you might not normally have to discuss, and our culture discourages discussion of, can be very stressful. Perhaps because of the number and complexity of psychological, behavioural and physical changes involved in becoming a person with IBD, researchers have found it difficult to establish consistent links with stress as either the initial trigger for IBD or the cause of relapses. So when I reviewed the research to date, I had three aims: to understand the links between stress and the physical symptoms, between stress and psychological well-being and quality of life, and to identify what support had already been trialled that might have a positive effect on stress in IBD. We focused on studies with adults with IBD than those written in English. We excluded studies that had children or animals as participants and those conducted in laboratories. We also excluded cross-sectional studies which only look at a snapshot of one point in time, and those studies that had no measure of stress. So when searching for relevant published research, I kept the search terms quite wide. This meant that I ended up initially with a lot of research articles, over 5,000. Comparing the criteria I had set with the titles and summaries of these research records, I managed to narrow the focus eventually to 38 studies that either observed stress levels over time or trialled support for people with IBD. These studies involved 4,757 people with IBD overall in 13 countries, including the UK, dating from 1986 to 2020. So what did these 38 studies tell us? Well, it looks like stress can be followed by an increase in IBD symptoms. 11 studies found high stress led to an increased risk of more symptoms later. What's interesting is that 2 of these 11 studies also found high levels of disease activity led to an increase in stress. So stress and IBD could have a two-way relationship: stress increasing symptoms and increased symptoms causing stress. There was actually very little research on whether stress relates to people with IBD's psychological well-being and quality of life. Only 3 studies looked at this. These suggested a beneficial relationship between stress and social support and personal resilience, and an unhelpful relationship between stress and depression and quality of life. Finally, 12 of the 15 intervention studies found significant improvements in stress at the end of the study. Specifically, distress improved with cognitive behavioral-based techniques. Those are ones which look at how we think and behave in relation to our health. And this was true whether taking part in a group or a one-to-one program. Disease-specific stress, that is stress linked to a person with IBD's health, rather than general life stress, seemed to improve with educational, stress management, and exercise group programs. What else did we learn? One issue that was obvious looking at the research was that there were a lot of different definitions and measures of stress being used by researchers, which meant comparing studies was actually quite difficult. In the 38 studies reviewed, we identified 7 different ways of defining stress, and 36 different stress measures. Another issue was almost all the studies used questionnaires to measure stress. Now, this isn't surprising. Many researchers, particularly psychologists, do use questionnaires as they are convenient for people to fill out. However, existing stress questionnaires were often used without considering the nature of IBD symptoms, such as fatigue. This would cause people with IBD to answer differently anyway from someone who does not have IBD. In most cases, the stress questionnaires had not been tested beforehand to see whether they reflected what people with IBD considered stress or stressful. So to better understand what stress and its impact is in IBD, I have interviewed 10 people about their first year after being diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. There were a mix of people who had recently been diagnosed and those who had had colitis much, much longer. We focused on the first year after diagnosis because we wanted the findings of this research to inform the development of extra support that could be given soon after diagnosis to help cope with stress over the entire course of people's IBD journey. We aim to identify what the sources of stress affecting people at that time were, how they coped, and what additional support they think would have reduced stress and helped coping. I'm currently in the middle of analysing these interviews, but here are some quotes from them to give you a flavour of the issues that were coming up. Talking about having the colitis symptoms, a participant said, "I didn't want to have anybody round to my flat and I couldn't go out, of course, because I couldn't control what was going on." And talking about their approach to coping, they said, "If you try and keep an even keel mentally, if you don't respond or try not to respond in a negative fashion to these things," meaning the symptoms of colitis, "then your body is better able to deal with them." Once I've analysed the interviews, I will be using the findings in a feasibility study to identify what further support might help after diagnosis and to trial it. So if you or someone you know has ulcerative colitis and would like to be involved in developing this study, please do drop me an email. There's my email address there. As researchers, it's important for our studies to reflect as much as possible the experiences of the people most affected. To do this, we need people like you to talk to us about the issues we're looking at. I'd also just like to take this opportunity to thank those of you who have already given us advice and been interviewed for this research. Thank you so much, it's so helpful. So I think we've got just enough time to look at some of your insights or questions on stress. Maybe, Sam?
Yeah, we've had one comment regarding your question on stress in the chat. Somebody has said, "When I experience a high stress situation, I find I have an immediate bowel response, which sends me running to the toilet."
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's a fairly common experience, actually. And this is what we found with having so many definitions of stress. Some people talk about stress as that immediate event that's happened in your day, like you missed the bus or you got cut up by somebody in your car, and that, you know, that's when you have the sort of flight or fight response. So that potentially is something that affects your physical well-being in IBD. But there's also the definitions that are the very long-term in terms of actually people with IBD have so many more things they have to do to manage their health. They have restrictions on perhaps where they can go. Their relationships with other people might change. And that is not just a quick thing that happens. That's something that affects people for almost the rest of their lives, potentially. So there's a lot to unpack about that, but certainly some researchers do look at that physiological impact that we have from stress, that sort of fight or flight that you get, and whether that does sort of alert your immune system. And one of the things that you do, we know fight or flight affects your bowel immediately, usually to stop things happening, but in IBD perhaps there's a different sort of response. Any other thoughts about stress? I should really look at that. Stress can cause really horrible bloating and cramping, tummy churning and churning, worse than usual. Yeah, absolutely. And it's that thing of, not only are we people with IBD, we are just people as well. And so the common thing up with stress is that you get butterflies in your stomach, right? And so this led the Greeks to think, well, we must have a brain in our stomach that tells us that something's going on and we need to deal with it. Researchers now are talking about a second brain within the body, because your immune system works largely independently of your brain. It's a little general that marshals the forces. So if you catch COVID, off the general goes, makes all of the things that they need to do. Now, obviously, in the case of IBD, the general is a little bit confused and is attacking things that you do not want to be attacked. But that'll add, of course, to the physical sensations of bloating, cramping, tummy churning, of course. And also people who have something wrong with, their stomach are going to be more mindful. So, sometimes I've interviewed people and they said, I get a twinge in the stomach and I have to stop myself trying to self-diagnose what that might be, because it might just be my period, or it might just be something that is normal to the course of events for a person that's not having IBD. So do we have time? I'm going to keep going until I'm told not to.
Well, I'm going to have to call you to time shortly, Jacqueline.
Okay. I just saw there's one. Can we squeeze this one in? The only stress I have is for managing this disease, microscopic colitis. Thinking positively and making the most of times I'm well helps you. Absolutely. And I think that's the thing. There's as many ways of coping with IBD as there are people with IBD. I think personally, and this is an opinion rather than backed up by research, you need to find your own way of dealing with stress. And I think it's helpful to just think about what are the key things that are stressing me out, what do I find stressful, and what my personal take, how am I going to deal with those? Sorry, Lynn, I'll let you go.
No, Jacqueline, thank you so much. It's fascinating, and I hope when we get to the Q&A at the end, I've got something I'd like to ask you, so I'm going to hold that thought.
Lovely.
And thank you again. We are now moving on to our last speaker for the session, who we welcome Sue Blackwell. Sue, lovely to see you. And Sue has, I think, occupies a fairly unique position, because she is both, has moved from patient to researcher. So she really understands, both. She's a fantastic researcher, but she also understands the patient angle, and that's so important, isn't it? And Sue's going to talk to us about her work on parastomal hernias and shared decision making. So Sue, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks, Lynn. Let me just share my slides. Where are they? There we go. Okay. And I just can you see the slides okay? Hopefully.
We can, but we're getting a presenter view. So if you set in the slide, you'll see it properly.
Where am I going
from? Like that, I'd say okay. That would do it. Yeah.
There we go. That's better. I just want to apologise in advance. I've got the dog upstairs with me, so if he barks, I'll try and shut him up. So thanks very much for inviting me today. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, but also about my journey from being a patient to being a PhD student, partly because I haven't done very much yet on my PhD, because I only went full-time in February, so it's still quite early days. But here's me. So I sort of want to talk about how did I get here, because we had a really great session this morning about patient and public involvement, and I've kind of taken that a little bit further and switched over into being a researcher. So I thought I'd just go through how I got from being a patient to that. So we start in 2022 with being a patient. 2015 was my epiphany. 2019 was like, oh my goodness, and then 2022. So the patient, in 2002, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. So we've heard about that today as well. In 2005, I had emergency subtotal colectomy. And then since then, I have had other operations, but I've also had 6 parastomal hernia repairs. So that's where my interest in parastomal hernia has come from the actual lived experience of going through it and having some pretty rotten times over the years. So in 2015, I was a trustee of the Ileostomy Association, and ACPGBI ran the Delphi Games, so they're trying to work out the research priorities, and that was involving researchers, clinicians and patients. So IA was invited. The National Secretary couldn't go, so she said to me, could you go to this meeting? And I was in the civil service. I was like, yeah, I can take a day off, that's fine, I'll go. I had no idea what to expect, and I had no idea at that point that patients could be involved in designing or even delivering research, because I knew you could be in a trial as a patient, but I didn't realize that you could be involved in the background. So I went to one of the Delphi Game sessions, and there's one of the absolutely awful cheesy photos that they've always made us pose for at the college to prove that we'd been there. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. I quite enjoy this. And I think, as some of the guys said this morning, once you've done one thing, you get asked to do others. So I went along to 2 of the Delphi sessions, and then it was like, oh, well, would you help us with this? And would you help us with that? And things kind of started to snowball a little bit. So then after that, I've been involved in lots of different things. These 5 are just some of the NIHR funded studies that I've been involved in, either as a trial management group or on the trial steering committee, providing the oversight to the trial. So it's really interesting to do things, and as you move along from one to another, you kind of learn, and you're able to, I think, you know, become a better patient person, or a better researcher even. The more you do, the more you learn. Although when it, as I'll explain in a minute, when it then comes to doing your own research, you realise you don't really know anything, and you're starting from scratch at the beginning. And then in 2019, it sounds a bit big-headed, but I kind of feel like we made colorectal history. Now, the background to that was the European Colorectal Surgeons meeting in Nice in 2018, when Nicola Fernhead, who was the past president of ACP, said, oh, the time's now right for the first patient-led grant application, isn't it, Sue? And I just went, yeah, okay. And, you know, I think Nicola's wonderful, and without her, I wouldn't be doing any of this. And I always say, you know, she could ask me to swim the channel, and I wouldn't say, well, I can't swim very well, I'll drown. I'd just say, when would you like me to do it? And worry about it later. So I submitted an application to BDRF, which was the charity that then merged to become BR UK, to do a study, and amazingly, it was funded. And I was absolutely gobsmacked, and people at work were like, oh, is there something wrong? And I was like, no, I'm just actually really happy, and this is me smiling. Doesn't happen very often. So that study was PAPOOS, which was looking at the patient experience, pregnancy outcomes after stoma surgery for IBD specifically. So with PAPOOS, we did a multi-center retrospective audit. So we had 15 hospitals. We have got the largest data set ever on pregnancy with a stoma, which was really fantastic. And what's great about this is we had a really great team. You know, I was a CI, but 2 fantastic gastroenterologists, Christian Sellinger and Matt Brooks. We had an obstetrician, we had colorectal trainees. So it was really a multidisciplinary team. And because it was so novel, and because it was such, nobody had really looked at it before, and we had the biggest data set, actually the dissemination has been fantastic, and we've been able to present it at lots and lots of different conferences. Now, if people are interested, you can read the manuscript. So it was published open access so that anyone can read it. So if you just Google colorectal disease and PAPOOS study, you should be able to find it. So please download it, because I'm still a little bit traumatized, because it costs just over £3,000 to publish open access, and I've never got over that. It wasn't my money, it was a grant money, but I think it's a lot. And then one of the best things was that this year I was invited to present the results at the Australasian Stoma Nurses Conference, and I got to meet Matilda and have a little cuddle, and she was very much worth the journey. Then one of the other things I then moved on to do was DISCO with Susan Moog and Rebecca Fish, which is looking at standards and outcomes for colorectal optimization, pre-op optimization. We're waiting for the paper to hopefully pass peer review. And then also funded by BI UK, PROFA, which is an international cohort study that I'm CI on with Tom Pinkney from Birmingham. And we've actually just opened in Birmingham last month, and we've got lots of other sites in setup. And this actually then feeds into my PhD. So Nigel said this morning that lots of people that do PPI are old and retired. I'm old, but not retired yet, counting down the years. But doing everything I did was really great CV building, because obviously if you want to do a PhD, you have to be able to prove to the university that, you know, you've got a track record and that you can do it, let alone actually get funding. So I've been able to do lots and lots of things, and I've had some amazing opportunities, but about 80% or more of my annual leave every year was used for conferences and meetings. So that was fine. I was happy to do it. I don't have a family. I'm single. It's okay. But sometimes PPI can take over your life, and it's something that, you know, people need to think about, but it can be great. And I did once cancel a holiday in Venice to go to a TSC meeting in Birmingham. Not quite the same, although they both have canals. So in 2022, I applied for the PhD funding round with Bowel Research UK. And I was absolutely amazed to get an email from Georgia in December to tell me that I had been successful. And I was convinced I wouldn't be, because I knew some of the other people that had applied, and they've got very science-based projects. And I was like, mine's very, I quote, touchy-feely, it's qualitative. So I was just absolutely amazed. So it's just been a bit of a whirlwind since then, because I got the email and I'd handed my notice in within half an hour, and I was like, I'm going to be a full-time student. So my PhD is looking at parastomal hernia and shared decision making. So one of the things I want to do is to talk to patients to find out what their experiences are of having a parastomal hernia, what they wanted to know about treatment, and also why they wanted treatment, whether they wanted to have conservative management or have surgery, and to look at things like that, to look at the information that's currently out there for patients and see, is it any good? What's the quality like? Is it useful? And then also to talk to surgeons and stoma nurses about what they think about shared decision making and parastomal hernia treatment. And then hopefully at the end of all of that, to work with a group of patients to produce a patient information aid, so that patients who get diagnosed with a parastomal hernia need to think about treatment have the right information that includes things that they want to know in patient-friendly language, so that they can make proper decisions and actually have proper shared decision making. And there's a nice little diagram there that shows how things fit in. And over on under WP1, if you want WP1B, the PROF and MyMop data in PROFA, we're using MyMop, which is a outcomes questionnaire, but the novelty of that is at the beginning, the patient sets the outcomes that they want to be measured. So you get a form and you tick the boxes and it's like, yeah, not really interested in any of these. But with MyMop, you could say, right, what I want to be able to do is eat the pizza or wear my favorite dress after my parastomal hernia treatment. And so I'm going to be looking at that. And that's a big part. So that is how PROFA then links with the PhD. So why are we doing it? Why am I doing it? And why is it needed? Well, these are some of the previous parastomal hernia studies that have been done. They're all clinical. Most of them, they all look at recurrence, which is not actually maybe the issue, its impact on quality of life, but they look at it, clinical recurrence, and measure it by CT. Hardly any of them look at why the patient had the parastomal hernia repair in the first place. Only two used pain scores as a PROM. It's not really a PROM, and a couple looked at quality of life, but they didn't use any good quality of life scores, so they weren't really relevant to parastomal hernia. So all the research that's been done before has really been clinical. Nobody's really said to patients, what is it that matters to you? What do you want from this? And we know that recurrence rates for parastomal hernia are really high. That's a tweet from quite a long time ago now, where Neil was quoting some data. And you see that, you know, repair number 1, recurrence rate 56%. You know, you're probably looking, I think most people would sort of say about 60%. Now that's big, because people have an operation and think that that's it, they're going to be fixed. So that's really why, you know, we need to do this research to find out what matters to patients. And at the colorectal surgeons conference last month, we did say to them, if this was cancer surgery, you'd be stopped from doing it. Nobody would accept a 60% recurrence rate for cancer surgery. We shouldn't ask patients to put themselves through surgery for something that is going to recur. It's just not fair on the patient. So this is one of the first bits of work I've done. As I said, I only started full-time in February. This is just looking at the information that's out there and assessing it against a tool called Discern, which has been developed to look and measure quality. And as you can see, there's an awful lot of red there and not very much green. So the information that's out there isn't very good quality, isn't able to really help patients make those decisions. So this is one of the key things, because this will feed into the patient information aid at the end. Hopefully coming soon, going to be advertising for patients to be interviewed to find out what matters to them around a whole range of things to do with having a parastomal hernia. It's at NHS Research Ethics Committee today, so I should hopefully hear soon. So that's the next stage, and BR UK will advertise that via their part network as well. So if there's anybody listening that would be interested in being interviewed, keep an eye out for that. So it's going to keep me busy for the next 3 years, but I think it's really, really worthwhile, and it's just so fantastic. The Bowel Research UK have funded it, and have also sort of gone, even with Papoose and that, I thought, well, actually, you know what, we don't have to stick to the traditional, you have to be a surgeon, you have to be a proper researcher to do this. You can actually be a patient with a real interest and actually get funded to do things. So there's just a couple of people I have to mention. Nicola Fernhead, without her, I wouldn't be doing any of this. And I sometimes think some people would think, I wish she'd never got her involved, but she did. Neil Smart and Tom Pinkney, my 2 partners in crime on all things parastomal hernia. And then finally, this time last year, I had a dream, and the dream was that I'd get my grant application funded, I'd leave my job, and I'd get a dog. And I did, and that's Bob. And he's sitting down very quietly, and he hasn't barked. But without the grant, I wouldn't have Bob. So Bob and my PhD are the 2 most important things. But thank you again to BR UK for funding me. Thank you for having me today. And if anybody's got any questions on parastomal hernia, you can find me on Twitter, and I'll always answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. What a fascinating session. And it is so lovely to hear, you know, that patient voice in the research, and that what matters to patients is being considered. So I think what you're doing is enriching bowel research without a doubt. So thank you very much. And we've now got some time for questions. So I'm going to go into the chat and the Q&A and ask all our speakers, and Horace, if you're there to come back, and we'll run through some of these questions. There's one here actually to all of them, but I guess especially perhaps to Horace. How does appendicectomy affect IBD?
So I don't think anyone knows for certain, and it's the topic of much conjecture at the moment. But what we do know is that if you've had a previous appendicectomy, then you are less likely to develop ulcerative colitis. And there are some people who, when they have ulcerative colitis and have their appendix out, then it gets a bit better. It's a matter for debate. There are some studies which may show that if you've had a previous appendicectomy, then you're more likely to get Crohn's disease, paradoxically. So it's an interesting one.
Oh, thank you.
Can I just add to that, because I'm on the TSC for a Cure too, so that is looking at the role of appendicectomy in managing ulcerative colitis. So there is a trial currently going on
beforehand. This is actually managing it when you've got the colitis, taking out the appendix and seeing if it makes you better. And there are some good Swedish case series on that, aren't there, Sue? So it's interesting to see.
Really, thank you. Now here's one from somebody I know, Neil Boom, asking, Neil asks, please can you explain more about omic technologies? Are they new?
Yes, I think in 15 minutes it was a big ask to go through everything that we are up to. But these omic technologies have really been coming to the fore over the last 20 years as computing technology has improved. And so what it really means is being able to genotype all of the bugs that live in your gut. That's the microbiome impact. And so you can look at all of these genes for multitudes of different bugs, and you've then got the computing technology to be able to work out where the differences lie, what the bugs are, etc., etc. And the same thing goes for this metabolomics, which is probably more recent, and that's been going on for about the last 10 or 15 years. Again, we're using complex technologies like mass spectrometry to be able to measure all of these different tiny chemicals which are going around in every bit of our body. And so we can use biosamples, biofluids, etc., to measure what these metabolites are that are in different biofluids. And again, to compare them between different diseases, different interventions. There's a lot of interest in it with regards to diet at the moment, for example, whether eating certain things actually affects your metabolism of other things, and whether it affects your gut, etc., etc. So these omic technologies, the last 10 to 20 years, but really burgeoning at the moment as computing abilities get better and better.
Thank you, Horace. There's a couple more. I've just been into the Q&A bit, and there's a question for Horace from Ellen saying, I wonder why microscopic colitis wasn't included in your first slide. Do you have anything to say, Horace?
Yes, apologies for that. Really, this research into IBD is about the macroscopic colitides rather than microscopic colitis, which, as I'm sure a lot of people on this chat will know, probably has a slightly different causation. It certainly has different treatments from the macroscopic colitides, although there are big overlaps here. So I would apologize to Ellen for that, because it is certainly one of the inflammatory bowel diseases, but not necessarily caused by the same things as the macroscopic colitides. So apologies.
Well, thank you. And one from Tom for you, Horace. It says, Tom says, what does the current research say about the impact of ethnicity on inflammatory bowel disease?
So I think it's interesting to note that the US has done quite a lot of research onto disparities and health inequalities in their Hispanic and their African American populations. There has been absolutely no research at all into whether different treatments affect different ethnicities differently, even though that is the case for certain other medications used for other conditions. And so we're going to be doing this for the first time to work out whether the treatments that we're giving should be used exactly the same between people of different ethnicities, or whether there needs to be a slight adjustment. In terms of the phenotype of the disease, then we at Imperial and in West London, and there are other groups that have been doing it in East London and Leicester, have looked at South Asian populations, where we know, for example, that South Asians with ulcerative colitis are more likely to have the extensive type of the disease, which means the disease which is affecting the whole colon, and less likely to have proctitis, which is the disease affecting just the lower bit or the rectum. So there are both phenotypic differences, which are the differences in the characteristics of the disease where we're seeing it, but we don't know about treatment yet. And so that's where this project comes in.
Great, thank you. And the last one for you, Horace, and then I'm going to go back to Sue and Jacqueline, is how do we get involved in your research project?
Absolutely. So we're going to be sharing with Sam the contact details. No problem at all. So we've got the Imperial patient public involvement, and I'm the sort of lead for that in our part of the Imperial BRC. But when we applied for this grant and got it from BR UK, then one of our aspirations was to work with you guys as well. So here I am, and that's what we'll be up to.
Oh, thank you so much. Jacqueline, coming back to you, there were a few more things, there were a few more comments, weren't there, in the chat about stress, and I know I cut you off, so you know, we've got some more time now, and I'm sure Sue has got, you know, some really good thoughts, also being a patient researcher, about the whole role of stress and things too.
Yeah, Sue and I need to get a coffee really, because I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis 23 years ago and did lots of other things, including the civil service. And then I'm now researching ulcerative colitis. And I think this is a trend that we're seeing in researchers who kind of doctor heal thyself, you know, we're coming in with that experience and knowledge of our own IBD journey and bringing that to when we speak to people with IBD, so that we can get what's specific and unique about their experience and how that contrasts with us, and bringing that into the analysis that we subsequently do. I think I've commented on all the stress things, but if I've missed anyone, then do let me know.
No, I think you have. I just sort of saw a few more. But one thing that always particularly interests me is the effects of sort of chronic, sort of incremental stress. And I remember a long sort of time ago, you know, as learning about sort of stress management and being told about, you know, the concept that you have a stress bucket, you know, and that gets filled up during the day, and on a really bad day it's like water in a bucket, it overfills and it spills over, and it's when we often are not at our best and we don't behave as perhaps we would like to when our buckets weren't overflowing. But in the normal course of events, you go home, you de-stress, you have some relaxation time, you have a good night's sleep, and that bucket, you know, empties. But when you're facing the sorts of challenges that you face with inflammatory bowel disease, that bucket doesn't empty very much, does it? And you know, and it very quickly empties up to overfilling every day, and it's that sort of chronic living with chronic stress and never quite getting a break from it that I think is you know, I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, actually that's probably reflected in the most popular theory of stress, is that, you know, people get stressed when the challenge that they're presented with is bigger than the resources they feel that they have. Not necessarily the resources they actually have, but the ones that they feel they can deploy at that moment to deal with it. And the thing obviously with inflammatory bowel disease and all chronic illnesses is that there is no end. You know, you have to learn to become a person with that condition. And it reminds me very much of, I'm sure you've all heard of the, you know, when you go through a bereavement, it's not that that person, that pain from that bereavement ever goes. It's always there, but what you do is you try and enlarge yourself around that bereavement, and that's very much the tack that we're looking at in terms of the theory that, you know, there are going to be some things that will come back, and unfortunately you have no control over, but what you have a possibility of is to enlarge your life around it. So you know, some people have been talking about having to actually make some really pretty tough life decisions and work and things like that to accommodate it. But the more resources you can give yourself, whether that be a social support network, whether that's just having more knowledge of the condition, whether that's actually, you know, these are the ways that I'm going to deal with the emotional side of things. The more of those you have, the more you're enlarging that bucket. So it's more about enlarging the bucket rather than trying to reduce the things that go in the bucket, because potentially that's not possible. It's out with your control.
Wise words indeed. Sue, any final thoughts from you?
No, I'm just going to say, I think because the stress is very interesting, because I think some people, I think I probably thrive on stress, but I do think that's due to, I don't know, maybe somebody more clever might say no, it's not, but I often think it's due to my upbringing, because my dad was in the army, so we moved, you know, I've been to 3 primary schools by the time I was 8. So, and I've kind of kept that doing random things as an adult, because I took a career break from the civil service and moved from London to Derry in Northern Ireland, and I didn't know anybody, did my masters, and then I moved back, and then I just up sticks and left London and moved to Liverpool, and I didn't know anybody here. So, which I think a lot of people would find things like that very, very stressful, but I'm just like, yeah, that's just, you know, something new. So I think, you know, you're either really great at dealing with stress, or stress is something that really does impact you. So I think it's really interesting area to look at, especially for IBD.
Well, thank you. And of course, there's Bob, and Bob's a great de-stressor.
Or stressor when he's chewing the Lego.
Thank you all very, very much. Now, if I look at I know that one thing that Sam wanted me to talk about before we end this session is something else that we're doing as a charity, and we are getting involved in a diverticular disease priority setting partnership. You heard Sue talking about the Delphi Games. Well, this is a sort of a version, in a sense, a little bit like that, but we're working with the James Lind Alliance and Guts UK to get a diverticular disease priority setting partnership started, and to set those priorities for research around diverticular disease. Sam is going to put her email address into the chat, so that anybody interested in getting involved in that PSP, please get in touch with Sam. So it just remains for me to say once again a huge thank you to Horace and Jacqueline and Sue for giving us their time this afternoon and sharing their expertise. It's amazing, and we are very proud to have you associated with us. It's wonderful. So thank you. And I need to remind you that the next session will start at 3 o'clock in 28 minutes, and I think Sam will let us go and get a cup of tea.